Thanks for tuning in. I'm Leslie Bonds, one of 5 Guided Pathways regional coordinators supporting the greater Los Angeles region. My hope is this brief video will help equity leads and their teams to understand the key elements of the 2022-25 Student Equity Plan. 5 years ago, the Vision for Success catalyzed a paradigm shift in higher education statewide, challenging us to acknowledge that while well-intentioned, our institutions have historically failed to adequately address and dismantle systemic barriers that produce inequitable outcomes, particularly for students of color. The 2022-25 Student Equity Plan paves the way for colleges across the system to commit to sharpening our focus on dismantling these institutional barriers while intensifying our resolve to achieve racial equity and outcomes for our students of color. Most of us know the goals detailed in the Vision for Success around equitable student success. Let's also briefly review the system commitments as they serve as the overarching principles that guide this plan. Specifically, in the 2022-25 plan, you should see evidence-based decision-making and institutional ownership of student access, success, and completion woven throughout the document. We encourage you to keep these commitments in mind as you proceed in your own plan development. In the spirit of evidence-based decision-making, we should pause to clarify exactly who it is we're serving in our system and how we have historically addressed the needs of these students. Following the 2019-2022 Equity Plan submission, the California Community College's Chancellor's Office commissioned an analysis of those equity plans with the Center for Urban Education, otherwise known as CUE, out of USC. Despite nearly 70% of students in the system identifying with one or more racial or ethnic groups, most plans have largely fallen short of addressing the strengths and needs of these students. In their report, CUE noted the plans demonstrated generic equity, not racial equity, meaning that racial equity is largely not addressed. For example, the authors wrote, 1. The majority of activity descriptions do not include references to specific racial groups despite metrics that specifically name racial groups. 2. Activity descriptions tend to be focused on all students or disproportionately impacted students in the aggregate. 3. Most plans do not address racism. And 4. Finally, most plans do not define the term equity. When colleges did provide their definition of equity, it was generic and did not reference race. Since the 2019-2022 plans were authored, much has happened. In 2020, the convergence of a global pandemic and a reckoning with racial injustice prompted Chancellor Oakley to make a call to action to mobilize the system to use our collective positions of privilege, influence, and power to recenter racial equity. A part of that work included codifying the system's stance on DEI in Title V, an excerpt of which you see on the screen here. Notably, the commitment focuses both on individual and systemic change and makes a commitment to anti-racism. As you prepare to develop your student equity plan, we encourage you to consider your response to the call to action and alignment with the statement on DEI and the California community colleges. In addition to their findings about race-neutral planning statements, the CUE analysis of student equity plans also found that over 65% of activities resided in student services, but few addressed classrooms and curriculum. We hope this plan also prompts a deep consideration about the ways in which what happens in the classroom matters a whole lot, and how failing to address that aspect of the student experience results in a definitively non-systematic approach to student equity. To address systemic inequities, we need systemic responses, which requires us to work across classified management, faculty, your executive leadership team, your board, and even your surrounding community. So let's now move into how those findings have informed a shift in plan design for the 2022-25 cycle. The Student Equity Plan Work Group set out to ensure this plan focuses less on transactional activities and more on systemic transformation. We aim to move away from a compliance and deficit orientation to one that is focused on continuous improvement and honors the knowledge, skills, and experience campus practitioners hold. As we've already noted, this plan will create the conditions for you to describe the ways in which your efforts are and will be race conscious. Finally, we're inching further toward a plan that moves equity planning out of the hands of a single individual or committee toward a whole college integrated approach. The CUE report summarized findings of their analysis of 113 student equity plans, which included a total of 1,853 activities. Some colleges proposed 2 activities and others proposed 100, but on average it was around 17 activities. Generally speaking, CUE found the activities were sort of one-off band-aids, a scattershot of activities seemingly disconnected from the larger goals and campus context. And more than that, most activities were race neutral, suggesting all students would benefit from these interventions. Yet the California Community College Vision for Success explicitly names Guided Pathways as the organizing framework for all efforts designed to improve equitable student outcomes. The framework calls for comprehensive, transformative changes across an entire college, braided into a coherent plan for improvement. To accomplish the vision, the Guided Pathways framework calls practitioners to analyze existing college structures, identify changes necessary to reform these structures, and implement those changes to achieve equitable outcomes for our students and communities. In this plan, you should see a major shift away from a listing of activities and instead an opportunity to really think about the policies, initiatives, cultures, and practices at your institution that impede student equity as they exist currently, and a space to envision how you can alter these structures in order to produce more equitable outcomes. This is an intentional shift from the student deficit mindset that unfortunately permeated a lot of plans in the last round toward an institutional focus. In other words, this shift represents a move toward integration of student equity efforts in line with the Guided Pathways framework's call to focus on structural change. To accomplish that shift, the student equity plan at a high level includes these key components: data, target outcomes, structure evaluation, and planning and action. Those elements are embedded into a template with 4 parts. The prelude includes a few resources and background information to provide context and a foundation for your current and future equity efforts. We recommend you view these resources before you get started. They've been curated by the task force. The fillable template will help you work outside of NOVA if you'd like. I'll cover the structure in a moment, but you should expect to address 5 metrics. The survey is optional. You may choose to respond to as many of the prompts as you'd like. We recommend you use this space as an opportunity to share successes, note areas for improvement, and detail any college-specific plans that you'll address in those topics. Addendum materials may provide helpful context, research, or resources you may wish to reference as you engage your local teams in the process. This is not intended to be a comprehensive list. Aside from the prelude and addendum materials, the actual plan has 4 key sections we will review in greater detail in this video. They include a reflection, an analysis of student populations experiencing DI, plans to address all 5 metrics, and an optional student support integration survey. In the first section, you'll be prompted to reflect on the 2019-2022 plan. We ask for a brief response to a few key areas, notably around race consciousness, and an acknowledgement of the ways in which the pandemic altered your student equity work in the past couple of years. I want to pause here to emphasize the focus on racial equity. As previously discussed, the CUE analysis found most plans in 2019-2022 were race neutral at best. But let me take a moment here to absorb some of that responsibility on behalf of the current task force. When we came together about 6 months ago, we had a conversation about the ways in which the last plan didn't yield the kind of results we wanted. In that conversation, we were able to acknowledge that the structure of the plan didn't lend itself to deep, radical, transformative, racially just change. The plan didn't create the conditions for the authors to really deliver what we think we want. And that exact practice of acknowledging our own role in yielding a strong output is the kind of process we aim to help colleges engage in through the next plan. In other words, what role have your college's policies, practices, structures, and culture played in impeding or creating the conditions for racial equity to date? So that's how we started the framing. We wanted to tap into this possibility, to leverage it, and to prompt an opportunity for you to engage in a deep interrogation of root causes. We believe that when we focus our efforts on systemic root causes, the ways in which BIPOC folks have been excluded and marginalized as opposed to non-systemic Band-Aid solutions, we create a more accessible, equitable, affirming, engaging college for all students. After completing a brief reflection, you'll be asked to review state-provided data, local data, and consider your local context and priorities to select the student population experiencing the most significant disproportionate impact for each of the 5 metrics you see here. They include successful enrollment, completion of transfer-level math and English, retention from the first primary term to the secondary term, completion, and transfer. The heart of the plan is in section 3. You'll repeat the planning process outlined on the right at least 5 times, once for each metric. Once you have selected the student population, you'll be asked which outcomes your college will target for this metric and population for 2022-25. You may enter 1, 2, or 3-year outcomes, and you may add as many or as few outcomes as you'd like, and you may self-define these outcomes. Outcomes may be quantitative or qualitative. Truly, this section is for your own planning and improvement purposes, so you should establish your targets accordingly. The next element is a structure evaluation. We know the Guided Pathways Framework calls practitioners to analyze existing college structures, identify reforms needed, and implement those changes. As such, this section of the Student Equity Plan is designed to prompt a structural analysis of the myriad aspects in institution, including policies, processes, practices, and culture that impedes equitable student outcomes across instruction, student affairs, business services, or other divisions. Once you've identified what about your current structure you aim to change in order to reach your target outcomes, you'll have an opportunity to outline specific action steps you'll take to achieve that change, as well as to communicate to the CO any resources you need to get there. Now let's move through an example of a plan for a single metric. This example is simply to illustrate the workflow. Beginning with the outcome successful enrollment, let's say you've identified Black and African American students are experiencing significant disproportionate impact. From there, you can develop 3-year targets in line with your enrollment goals to steadily increase your presence in high schools that serve a large proportion of Black students. You know these outcomes because in your review of the institutional structure, you were able to identify an instructional practice that limits an otherwise high-impact entry point for students. In this example, the college sees they've been delivering dual enrollment at a predominantly white and affluent high school. To move toward a more ideal dual enrollment practice, the institution identified opportunities to work with more diverse high schools in order to strengthen the pipeline from K-12 to the college and open pathways to higher education for their Black students. To accomplish this, the college identified a few action steps they must take to get there, including hiring a coordinator, developing an MOU, ensuring their program maps represent this on-ramp, and offering anti-racist professional development to dual enrollment instructors. Finally, the college notes a policy barrier that impedes their scale of this practice for the CO's consideration. While the workflow looks lengthy, the responses are concise, race-conscious, and focused on an institutional reform rather than on student deficits. The final section of the plan is optional. You may choose to respond to as many of the prompts here as you'd like. The workgroup selected these particular areas of focus as they align with many recent legislated funding allocations and mandates, all with the goal of advancing student equity. The intent is to spark dialogue about the ways in which these varied initiatives and funding allocations can be braided into your larger equity planning efforts. For instance, as an equity director, you may not directly oversee mental health services. However, this prompt may create an opportunity for you to open dialogue with the individual on campus who is responsible to explore how you might collaborate to advance your shared goals. We recommend you use this space as an opportunity to share successes, note areas for improvement, and detail any college-specific plans to address the topics you see on the slide here. Moving forward, here are a few key dates to note. The plan is due on November 30th, 2022, over 7 months from the plan's release date. Additional information about future webinars and training opportunities is forthcoming, but you may contact cprograminfo at cccco.edu for information on how to register if you have questions. Finally, you may always reach out to your Guided Pathways Regional Coordinator with questions or for support as you engage in this work. If your college is not in the greater Los Angeles region, which includes LA, OC, and the South Central Coast, you may always ask us to put you in touch with your RC or visit successcenter.cccco.edu to find your GPRC. You can also keep up with us on social media, join our listserv, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to be sure you're getting up-to-date information. And with that, we'd like to leave you with an excerpt from the DEI statement, which reads, "As a collective community of individual colleges, we're invested in cultivating and maintaining a climate where equity, anti-racism, and mutual respect are both intrinsic and explicit by valuing individuals and groups from all backgrounds, demographics, and experiences." Thanks for taking the time to review this video and for all you do to support our students.